The Fortnight for Freedom is an annual event in the American Church, but this year's theme, the freedom to bear witness, is particularly important and timely. And my message to you, as I've already said, my message to you is troubling. It's straightforward, but if I'm correct about it, deeply troubling. We are living amidst a dramatic worldwide decline in religious freedom, a decline that might reasonably be labeled a crisis. It's now reached our own beloved country. While the symptoms of the crisis vary, its common core is easy to say. It's an unwillingness to protect and defend religious liberty. That fundamental right derives from many sources, but it's achieved its fullest expression here in our own country. If it's lost here, it's unlikely to be regained elsewhere. Indeed, if religious freedom is the first freedom, as our nation historically has asserted, and as the Church teaches, the stakes involved in this worldwide crisis are extraordinary for the United States, for the Church, and for international justice and peace. In my view, this means not only that we Catholics ought to have the freedom to bear witness, but we have a responsibility to bear witness. That responsibility derives first and foremost from our obligation to be faithful to the truth, that is, the teachings of Jesus Christ and the Church. Of course, we Catholics are also a hopeful people, most of us. We know, or we ought to know, that whatever happens in this fallen world, the ultimate victory has already been won. And yet, we must also remember that our Lord, who won that victory for us, asks us to live in this world and to engage it, the world He created, to love His creatures and to work for the common good. We must, as the Holy Father has urged us, be a field hospital in the world. So in this sense, our responsibility also extends to our roles as Catholic citizens of this great country, who love our country and who have a profound duty to it as well. So let's begin with a definition of religious freedom. I don't want to sound like a professor, but I can't help it. What are we talking about? All of us believe in it. I've never, frankly, I've traveled the world, never heard anybody except one Saudi guy who really looked like Darth Vader say, I'm against religious freedom. The Chinese say they're for it. Everybody says they're for it. What do I mean by it? I mean religious liberty is the right to believe or not. But if you believe, the right to act on the basis of your belief, individually and with others in this great church, both in private worship and in the public life of the nation. So this means the right to bring my religious beliefs into my life as a citizen of the United States, including in my profession or my business or my charity or my NGO, whatever it is I do publicly. Religious freedom means I have the right to bring my beliefs into that. But especially, and here's where we get into the heavy weather, it means that I must bring my religious beliefs into the political life of the nation. Politics is the way we organize our lives together. Are we supposed to be silent about that because we're Catholics? And it means, finally, that all religious ideas and actors should be treated equally under the law. Now, of course, there are limits to religious freedom, as there are to any freedom. For example, I can't use religion as an excuse for violence or to limit the fundamental rights of others. But as our founders understood quite well, those limits must be applied in a way that favors religion in public life, not disfavors it. So, based on that definition, let me give you 3 propositions. Boy, I'm really sounding like a professor here. My apologies. 3 things I want to say that will sort of lead into everything I'm going to say. First, history, scholarship, and common sense converge in demonstrating that a robust system of religious freedom is necessary for every human being for their flourishing and every society. Without it, no society can achieve stable self-government, social harmony, economic growth. Think about that. Not to mention equality and freedom. More broadly, the world can't achieve justice and peace and stability without religious freedom. That's proposition one. Second, notwithstanding the importance, and many people agree about this, there's argument about it, but notwithstanding the importance, religious liberty is under siege in most regions of the world. The consequences of this crisis for the United States and the world are staggering. They implicate the success or failure of struggling democracies, think Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan, economic development, think China, Western Europe, and the defeat of religion-based terrorism, both here and abroad. For all these reasons, addressing this crisis ought to be a high priority for the United States and for the Church. Third and final proposition. Propositions 1 and 2 are highly contested. The idea that religious freedom is necessary for all individuals and societies is fiercely contested in America today, not to mention in Saudi Arabia or China or Russia or Nigeria. Although it may not always appear to be so, there's a perfect storm of opposition to religious freedom throughout the world, characterized variously by hostility, skepticism, fear, and moral confusion. Outside the West, where religious freedom, religious belief and practice are for the most part widespread and growing, religion outside the West is vigorous, if you haven't noticed, for better and for worse. Religious freedom in full has never existed. The very idea of religious liberty is highly suspect in most of these nations, including the communist regimes, such as China and Cuba, countries where religion supports authoritarianism, such as Russia, and virtually all Muslim-majority countries, including those that are trying to adopt democracy. Although most of these nations have signed international covenants, which are often waved around, says here we all support religious liberty. And some of them have enacted constitutional provisions committing them to guaranteeing religious liberty. That's the best example I can imagine of what James Madison called a parchment barrier. Almost no nation has lived up to those commitments, and they certainly are not doing so now. In Europe, where the origins of religious freedom are buried deep in history, the decline of religion itself, especially Christianity, has dramatically reduced respect for any public expression of religion. The result has been the adoption of an understanding of religious liberty. Have you ever heard of this? As a freedom to worship. This is a thin and impoverished view of what was once considered a fundamental and universal human right. It unfortunately serves the contemporary European need to remove religion, or at least religions with traditional moral teachings, from the public square. And our own country, notwithstanding the continued vibrancy, if diminishing, there's disagreement about that, but certainly compared to Western Europe, this is the most religious Western country in the world. Notwithstanding that, the public expression of traditional religious values is under unrelenting assault. While there are many reasons for this development, in my opinion, the greatest single threat to religious freedom in the United States is same-sex marriage. Last week's 5-4 Supreme Court decision, authored by Justice Anthony Kennedy, swept aside our democratic process and imposed on our society a constitutional right for people of the same gender to marry. Most states had laws reflecting the millennia-old understanding of marriage is between one man and one woman, designed to nurture the conjugal relationship between a man and a woman and the well-being of their children. Americans were engaged in a debate over whether those laws should be changed, but that debate is now deemed by the Supreme Court to be over. Your voice, say 5 lawyers in Washington, no longer matters. As Chief Justice Roberts noted in dissent, 5 judges have simply imposed their preferences for same-sex marriage on our country. The Constitution, says the Chief Justice, does not support their action. But beyond the damage to marriage itself, the implications of this decision for religious liberty and for American democracy are quite serious. It seems to me highly likely that over time, Catholic and other Christian institutions such as schools, private businesses, charitable agencies, and even the clergy, will come under increasing legal and social pressure to abandon Christ's teachings on marriage and sexuality. Indeed, this has already begun. And it's happened with amazing speed. Just 20 years ago, our political leaders came together to pass, with overwhelming bipartisan support, something called, and the signature of President Clinton at the time, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. RFRA, it was called, said that a government may not burden the religious freedom of any American citizen without a compelling reason to do so. It's a very high bar. And even if such a reason can be found to exist, your freedom must be limited, still limited, in the least restrictive way, or not at all, even if a compelling reason exists to do so. In those 20 years, something dramatic has happened since the passage of RFRA. Led by Justice Kennedy, many of our political elites have concluded that religious freedom is no longer the first freedom of our nation, but a front for hatred and bigotry. The teachings of the Catholic Church are now particularly onerous in the eyes of many. Citing the Church's position on marriage, abortion, and contraception, the ACLU has, within the last week, called on Congress to abolish or change fundamentally the RFRA, to abolish legal protections for those who do not follow the new morality of sexual liberation. Unfortunately, most of our political leaders seem incapable of defending religious freedom. The recent firestorm over Indiana's passage of a state-level Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Indiana's RFRA, and the utter incapacity of its supporters to defend it is troubling. The idea that religious freedom must take second place to the new sexual morality was long ago embraced by the current administration, by much of the Democratic Party, and frankly, many members of the Republican Party. The implications of this phenomenon, the American abandonment of the first freedom, go far beyond our own shores. The United States is the only country in the world with a statutory requirement to advance international religious freedom in its foreign policy. Another excellent law signed by President Clinton in the 1990s, called the International Religious Freedom Act, passed unanimously, scant 17 years ago, signed by President Clinton. It reflected America's unique commitment to religious freedom for everybody, not just Americans. While other Western democracies are now, because of ISIS, beginning to express some interest in integrating this into their foreign policies, they are largely unequipped to carry this task out, historically and in terms of their contemporary understanding of what religious liberty is. Like it or not, only the United States has the legal and cultural experience to convince other nations to move toward religious freedom. But our policy has had virtually no impact. There are several reasons for that. Perhaps the most important is the difficulty of trying to sell a product that you don't believe in to people who share your skepticism, although for other reasons. So the stakes are high, as I say. If it's lost here in America, where can it be retrieved? And it's lost to the world would be a profound civilizational crisis. As for the Catholic Church in America, I know that some of our bishops, many of our bishops, and many of our Catholic institutions understand the dimensions of this threat. And I highly recommend to you, if you haven't already, statements by your own Archbishop Lori, by Cardinal Wuerl, by Bishop Kurtz, and others in the wake of the same-sex marriage decision, all of which touch on this issue of religious freedom. I have no doubt there are others who've made it clear to their flocks that the Church takes its teaching on marriage from Jesus himself. Can't change it. And the faithful are called to bear witness to the truth in their public lives, as well as in their prayer. This witness includes respectful criticism of the court for getting it so wrong, and thereby doing an injustice to the whole society of which we Catholics are a part. Unfortunately, I fear that some of the faithful and some of the clergy discount the threat to the freedom of the Church to continue to perform its role as salt and light in American society. I must tell you that I heard nothing of the court's decision from my own clergy. I don't believe that the American Church is speaking with anything approximating a consensus about the threat to religious freedom and to our right and our responsibility to bear witness. And I think this must change. We must affirm the duty and seize the opportunity to demonstrate to all Americans the intrinsic, irreplaceable value of religious freedom to them, whether they're religious or not. All right, let me spell this out a little more. Let me give you a very brief overview of the data on why this is a global crisis. Some of you may have heard of the Pew Research Center. It's in D.C. Nonpartisan, highly respected, puts out annual reports on every country. Monsignor, we were talking about annual reports. They put out one on every country in the world, but it's all data. It's data. It's based on the State Department reports and others. They measure government restrictions on religion and social hostilities toward religion in every country in the world. Give them a score. The latest report issued early this year, January 5th, 2015, confirmed, now listen to this, it's a profoundly disturbing statistic. 76% of the world's population live in countries where there is no religious freedom.
I missed the last slide. How a little louder, I'm sorry.
Sorry?
You want to say louder? I can't hear you because
Oh my goodness.
losing the last part of your sentence.
Are you guys losing me at the last part? You're okay? What about you that's asleep over there? You all right? The Pew Research Center put out a report in January saying 3/4 of the world's population, 3 out of 4 people on this earth don't have religious freedom or anything approximating. Now that's not 3/4 of the countries of the world, but you'd be surprised at some of the ones that rank high. European countries rank high. The United States is coming up. There are about 70 countries in the world that are the worst. Virtually all, not all of them, but many of them are Muslim majority countries. Overall, but not simply because of the Middle East, the Pew reports demonstrate that the global trends are downward. The problem is getting worse, not getting better. It wasn't 75% or 76% 5 years ago. It's getting worse. Violent religious persecution, including by terrorist groups, is growing and spreading throughout the Middle East. And of course, you're aware of that. According to the Pew reports, the religious minority most subject to persecution is, guess who? Christians. A close second are Muslim minorities, mainly persecuted in Muslim majority states. An additional troubling element of this global crisis is the rise of anti-Semitism. This has always existed to a certain extent in the Middle East, but we're now seeing it spread into Europe. This is a sure sign of civilizational crisis. Now, I'll come back to Europe and the United States in a minute, but let me put a few faces on these statistics that I've given you outside the West. There's scores of millions of human beings just like us, affected by the spread of violent religious persecution and extremism. In China, our banker, Tibetan Buddhists, Uyghur Muslims, Catholics, and Protestants are sometimes subject to brutal crackdowns, violent crackdowns by the Chinese government that fears any religion it can't control. It's not systematic, but it happens periodically. It's a tool of the Chinese government. In India, the world's largest democracy, where probably has come closest to true religious freedom than any non-Western country, nevertheless, the continued presence of Hindu extremism threatens religious freedom, especially the Muslim and Christian minorities. In Russia, the continued ascendancy of despots like Vladimir Putin has unfortunately been abetted by the Russian Orthodox Church, which believes that it can cooperate with the regime in order to maintain its monopoly on religion in Russia. They believe they have a historic claim to it. Well, there's some truth in that, but it works to abet authoritarianism. In these and other non-Muslim countries, the threat to religious freedom either comes from a secular elite or from a monopolist religious elite. The result is human suffering and instability. But the greatest threat to Christians and other minorities and religious freedom in the world, outside the West, comes from violent Islamist extremism. Unfortunately, the extremists are aided and abetted by routine practices in Muslim-majority states that are not practices of terrorists. They are so-called anti-blasphemy laws. You may have heard of them. Anti-defamation laws, anti-apostasy laws. These are believed by mainstream Muslims as necessary to protect their religion. Hey, I'm all for protecting my religion. But the Catholic Church learned a long time ago that it could not do so by privileged access to the civil and police powers of the state. If we can't help Islam understand the many Islams that are out there, that they have these laws and practices are a gateway to extremism because they prevent the moderates, so-called, the liberal Muslims who are there in those societies. They can't speak. They're charged with blasphemy. I tell my students the story of an Afghan graduate student a couple of years ago who wrote a graduate paper in which he argued, he did some research on the web, he argued from the Quran that Islam supports the full equality of men and women. His professor turned him in to local authorities. He was prosecuted, tried, convicted of blasphemy, and sentenced to death. A student. I love to tell my own students that story. The disadvantages of writing bad papers. In this case, though, you can't have a democracy, let alone any kind of stables. How do you get beyond that? Very important issue. Islamist terrorists are encouraged by this because they're the only ones left defining Islam. And they are being incubated and spreading throughout the Middle East. Their motives and views vary, but they share an understanding of Islam that boils down to this. If you offend Islam, as we understand it, you must be punished, including by torture and death. This is true if you're a non-Muslim, but it's doubly true if you're an unpopular Muslim or a wrong-thinking Muslim. Those who actively practice terrorist violence on this model include, of course, ISIS, which is most in the news this day, but it also includes a growing cadre. Some of them have been out there a long time. Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, the Taliban, Hamas, Hezbollah. Different ways of coming to the same notion that violence is necessary to defend my religion. Stories of Islamist violence and terror emerge almost daily. A recent example occurred on Holy Thursday in Kenya at Garissa College. You may have read of this. 4 al-Shabaab terrorists. I use them because you may not have heard of them, but it's not all ISIS. But it's the same motivation. They entered the campus, which had a lot of Christians, a lot of Muslims, and began a systematic slaughter of non-Muslim students. When they discovered a Christian prayer group, they threw grenades into the chapel. Then they moved to a women's dormitory. Women who could prove they were Muslim by reciting the Shahada, the Muslim profession of faith, were spared. Christians were either shot or their throats were slit. By nightfall, 148 students and staff had been slaughtered to defend Islam. I don't believe that is mainstream Islam. But we have a big problem in dealing with this phenomenon. It would be tragic enough if this were isolated, but it's not. And I had a list of other like stories to tell you, but I'll skip those. You get the point. Pope Francis has said that Christians are being persecuted in numbers exceeding those martyred during the Roman Empire. He's also condemned the world's complicit silence. He's right. The media reports the facts, but many refuse to acknowledge the religious nature of this crisis. And I'm emphasizing it not to condemn Islam, but to say that religious freedom is one way of fighting this problem. And it's a lot cheaper than blood and treasure and military force or one drone. When the Coptic Christians, unfortunately, this failure to call it by its name, we said that at dinner tonight. Call the thing by its name. That's literal. That's realism. This administration refuses to do this. When the 21 Coptic Christians, you remember, whose throats, who were decapitated by ISIS on the shores of the Mediterranean, many of them with Jesus' name on their lips as they died, the administration refused to call them Christians. Why? I really am not sure I understand the answer to that question, but I know it's an important question. Why is it that we refuse to credit what the terrorists themselves say they're doing? What advantage are we gaining? I suppose there are some legitimate debates to be had about how to do this, but I think all we're doing is fooling ourselves. How can you defeat any enemy if you willfully mischaracterize its goals and what's driving it? All right. In order to try and answer that question, let me turn to the church's role, in my view, proper role in this crisis, and to the dimensions of the crisis in the West. First, the dimensions in the West. The Pew reports I mentioned earlier show that things are getting worse in Western Europe and the United States. Violent persecution is not the norm, and please God, will never be. But it has been in the past. Pray for us, St. John Fisher, St. Thomas More. One interpretation of the death of St. John the Baptist. One interpretation of the death of St. John the Baptist was that he was killed for defending marriage. Read Mark. So even though persecution is not now in the West, I'll tell you a story in just a minute of how not long ago it was. Please God, it will return here. We would be foolish to conclude that it never could. In Europe, we've witnessed over the decades a sustained and devastating march through the culture by an aggressive secularism that permits people like you to go to church, no problem. You can go and burn incense, play bingo, whatever it is you Catholics do. But you can't bring your views into public life and try to influence the public life of the country. That's the French model. It's one all over Europe as far as I'm concerned. A couple of years ago, the Archbishop was good enough to mention that I run a religious freedom project at Georgetown. And we had an event at Oxford, Magdalen College, Oxford. I don't know if you're familiar with Oxford. I think that's where they filmed Chariots of Fire, the early parts of that at Oxford. Kind of a neat place. We examined the question of the rising tensions between religious freedom and homosexual rights claims. We had all points of view. We had a panel from North America, from the UK and Ireland, and one from Western Europe. Our keynote address was a guy at the time, I wonder if you know him, Archbishop. At the time, he was the Bishop of Paisley, Philip Tartaglia. He's today the Archbishop of Glasgow. He's an Italian Scot. You ever heard of such a thing? Somebody said Archbishop Tartaglia is Tony Soprano with a Scottish accent. A humble Tony Soprano. Well, he was our keynote. And he said, I expect, before I'm finished with my work as a bishop, to be before a criminal judge for defending the teachings of the church on marriage. And I couldn't help but remember the anti-Catholic penal laws that existed. You may not have heard of this, but in Scotland in the 18th century, after the Scottish Highlanders were overthrown and the Bonnie Prince Charlie and all of that, the English came in and said, we're going to remove Catholicism and the clan system from Scotland altogether. So the Mass was outlawed, priests were outlawed. Of course, this had existed earlier in England, but I'm talking about not so long ago. So I'm not suggesting that Scotland is returning to that. Frankly, Scotland's a beautiful land with not a lot of religious people in it. The Catholic Church, I think, has a marvelous opportunity in that beautiful country. My wife is a Macpherson, and so we've been to Scotland to chase down her roots. But religion in Europe is no longer seen as intrinsic. Religion in Europe is no longer seen as intrinsic to human dignity. It's generally understood as an opinion. You got your opinion, I got my opinion. Yours is kind of dangerous, but you're entitled to have it. If that's all religion is, and that is, alas, what it is thought of in much of Europe, we have a big problem. Is this what is happening in our own country? The malevolent idea that political expressions of religious ideas threaten democracy has been around for a long time, and most famously championed by the American political philosopher John Rawls. Some of you may have heard of him. I hope you haven't. Don't look him up. This has gained considerable purchase in our country in the last 20 years. It's contributed to the idea, most recently on display in Indiana in the Supreme Court, that religious arguments concerning marriage or, frankly, any other public moral issue constitute hatred. Or in the words of Justice Anthony Kennedy in an earlier decision, Windsor, which overturned the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, it constitutes, and I'm quoting, these are words used in the thing, malice. Malice. A desire to harm, a desire to injure, a desire to humiliate. If you defend marriage, says Justice Kennedy, that's what you're doing. That's a lie. And it's a terribly troubling lie. Religious liberty, in short, has become a front for bigotry, an illegitimate claim of privilege by people like you and me. The Catholic writer Mary Eberstadt, you may have heard of her, has dubbed this attitude the new intolerance. Its goal is to silence those who would resist the new public moral consensus in favor of what she charitably calls expressive individualism. This is the understanding of freedom as the right to follow one's appetites as long as the quest is consensual and doesn't restrict the freedom of somebody else. Those whose moral or religious convictions move in another direction are not to be tolerated. Let me give you one example among many of how this new intolerance affects human beings like you and me, and at the same time, American democracy. So this isn't just a tale of one 70-year-old woman named Barronelle Stutzman. It's a tale about American democracy, but it's a true story. Barronelle Stutzman, 70, 71 by now, grandmother of, I think, 24 children, Washington State, for decades has run a florist shop in Washington. She serves anybody that comes into her shop, including homosexual people. When a homosexual couple she had served for years, sold flowers to them for years, asked her to participate in their wedding, she said, I can't. I'm a Christian who believes in the Christian understanding of marriages between one man and one woman. The ACLU sued Mrs. Stutzman on grounds of discrimination, asking the state of Washington to coerce her to comply. And in an example of social coercion backed by the threat of state coercion, the ACLU went to Mrs. Stutzman and offered her a settlement. If you publicly recant, I'm thinking of 16th century England all of a sudden, donate $5,000 to an LGBT youth center, and agree to serve in LGBT ceremonies, we'll drop our suit. She refused. Then Washington State's Attorney General decided to sue Mrs. Stutzman. Here comes the state now, under Washington's Consumer Protection Act. This case, too, could have settled if she had agreed to pay several $1,000s and issue a public statement, a recantation. She responded, I can't. I cannot. Not just that I won't, I cannot. I'm almost thinking of Martin Luther here, forgive me. Here I stand. And she cited Washington State's constitutional guarantee of, quote, freedom of conscience in all matters of religious sentiment, unquote. That guarantee now seems to have no meaning whatsoever. In January of this year, a Superior Court judge in Washington State ruled Mrs. Stutzman was personally liable and that she must provide full wedding support for same-sex ceremonies, including custom design work to decorate, this is a judgment, custom design work to decorate the ceremony, delivery to the forum, staying at the ceremony to touch up the arrangements, and assisting the wedding party. Consider what is happening to this 70-year-old woman. happens to be Christian, she's being hounded by private ideologues and the state to renounce the teachings of Jesus Christ on marriage and to demonstrate publicly by actively supporting a same-sex marriage that she has repented. This is the United States of America. And if you think this, bizarre things happen in our country like any other. But there's a pattern. Begin to look for it. It's occurring with increasing frequency elsewhere in America. I'd give other, we don't have time, but there are other examples. The guy that was forced out of Firefox, Mozilla. Some of you have read that story. It's very similar. This kind of coercion is becoming the norm for ordinary people of faith who seek to live their lives in accordance with their beliefs about marriage and sexuality. As such, this portends a dangerous turn in American law and culture. It constitutes a step toward the destruction of religious liberty and in the direction of tyranny. At a minimum, it suggests that a new moral consensus in the United States is following the European path. Those who support the ideology of sexual liberation are determined to remove all counter-arguments, especially the Catholic Church, from the public square. I would suggest to you that to give in means to abandon Catholic teachings and their necessary role in creating a just society. To flee from this fight means abandoning the historic American commitment to religious freedom as the first freedom of the human soul, and to jettison the sacred principle that the democratic state may not coerce the conscience of a person. To give in means, in the words of Princeton professor Robert George, to proclaim that we are ashamed of the gospel. If we give up this fight, we will endanger American democracy precisely by undermining the norm of equality that the ideologues of sexual liberation purport to defend. And of course, our capitulation will place at risk libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church, the duty of the church to teach and to evangelize in the public life of the nation. Now, if you aren't all so dolefully depressed, let me put a little bit of hope into this. It's a great irony, but a cause for hope, that at the very moment when religious liberty is under sustained international pressure, different symptoms, as I said, but it's everywhere. Contemporary scholarship, the eggheads in universities, some of them, are discovering what our founding fathers understood 200 years ago. Religious freedom is necessary for every society and for every individual, whether they're religious or not, because it protects the right not to believe. This concept has deep roots in the Christian tradition and in Western history. Jesus himself taught, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, but only what is Caesar's, not what is God's. Early Christian thinkers developed this idea, including the 5th century Pope Gelasius. Catholic canonists and scholastics of the Middle Ages began to develop the idea of the sacredness of conscience. 800 years ago, the Magna Carta. You ever heard of that? This is the 800th anniversary. You know what the first words of the Magna Carta? It's a long thing. I'm not sure anybody's even King John didn't read all of it. It just goes on and on and on. But the first sentence is about the freedom of the church. And back then it was the Catholic Church, 1215. Just like the first sentences of the Bill of Rights are about religious freedom. 50 years ago, this year 2015 is a remarkable year for these things. This is the Dignitatis Humanae, which the Archbishop has spoken about so eloquently and will again later on this fall. Modern scholarship is rediscovering these. And I'll gloss over this, but they're discovering, for example, that religious freedom is good for business. Guess who knew that? You ever heard of William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania? You know what his primary pitch to people coming to Pennsylvania was at the time in the 17th, 18th centuries? Come to Pennsylvania, we have religious freedom, it's good for business. How did he know that? He wasn't a scholar. Well, a couple of hundred years later, we're proving it with statistical analysis, and we're also proving the same thing about terrorism. This is what my group at the Religious Freedom Project does. We fund scholars around the world. We have our own scholars. We're encouraging other scholars. We just had a group at the State University of New York that have put out an analysis that appears to show causation. Lower religious freedom, more religious terrorism. Higher religious freedom, less terrorism. Now, it's not that simple, but there's an argument to be made to societies that would like to get rid of the violence, the Muslims who are subject to the violence of their own terrorists. Egypt, if you don't move in the direction of religious freedom, call it whatever you want, equality under the law for all your religious groups, guess what? You're going to fail at what you want. Economic growth, security for your children, jobs. Religious freedom is important. Our founders understood it. We're rediscovering it. President Washington, in his farewell address, said to the nation, religious ideas in public life are, quote, necessary for political prosperity. Think about that. Necessary for political prosperity. What he's saying to the nation is, we need you religious people. Notice he didn't say Christians. Most of them were. But most of our founding fathers, I hate to tell you, they were a little quirky about their Christianity. I mean, Thomas Jefferson took a razor blade to the New Testament to take all the good stuff out. That's true. And by no means was he anything approaching an Orthodox Christian. But go to the Jefferson Memorial, my personal favorite. Read what's up there. This guy believed in God. He had a Christian conception of God, even though he's very anti-Catholic. The point is, they understood the need for human beings to express their religious views in public. And they said, this nation will fail. Our experiment in democracy will fail if we move away from it. All right, let me conclude. Usually I get applause. It's not really. I mean, if you've been around long enough with professors, that just means I got another 30 minutes to go. But it's the last 30 minutes. The core of my argument has been that the decline of religious freedom in the United States is harming American interests, harming American democracy and the Catholic Church, and at the same time reducing our capacity to perform a vital task to international peace and security, one that only this country can perform. And that is the task of convincing Egypt and China and Russia and Indonesia and India that religious freedom is in your interests. We can tell this story not because we're superior, because we have the First Amendment we want and all the other things that the bromides that people toss at me because I'm an acolyte of religious freedom. It's because every human being needs it. Sure, it's because I believe in God that I say that, but I can prove it without even mentioning God. The United States is the only nation that could do this if we choose to do it. Ironically, it's the public aspects of religion that are under siege here. If we're ever going to succeed with the Muslim world, do you think we can go to them and say, all right, here's what religious freedom means. It means you got to get Islam out of the public square. Now, you know what? To tell you the truth, I might support a project like that if I thought it was realistic, but it's not. If you know anything about Islam, the only way for these democracies to develop is to bring Islam into the public square and make it democratic and make it respect other religions. In other words, do what the Catholic Church has done over the course of 2 millennia. Unfortunately, we don't have 2 millennia. This is a national security imperative. Okay. What can the Church do to address this crisis at home? How can we help reconvince Americans and our foreign policy elites in particular that it's in our national interests It really doesn't matter. I mean, I lecture at the Foreign Service Institute, and the first thing I say is, I don't care what your religion is. Your job is to advance American interests in the world, and you got to understand what the world is. It's highly religious, whether you are or not, is irrelevant. You can't do your job if you don't understand religion. And religious freedom is not the only way, but it's a darn good way to understand how we should be doing this in our policy. First thing we can do as Catholics is say to our foreign policy elites and the American public that the Catholic case for religious freedom, namely the fundamental dignity and equality of every human being in the eyes of God, demands your respect, even if you don't believe in God. This argument protects you if you don't believe in God in a way that your definition of religious freedom will not protect me, because I do. Why? Because I believe that God created you, and I owe you an obligation not to coerce your conscience. I owe you an obligation because you are a human being who deserves my respect. And I will defend your right to express your views, even if they slam my religion. I love to tell my Muslim friends who complain about defamation of Islam, the New York Times defames my religion weekly, if not more frequently. But the response can't be violence. If we could convince the nations of Islam that they can defend their religion without violence, but by better preaching and teaching, we will have changed the world. But we can't convince our own skeptics. There's a staying power about this belief in God. Even if you don't believe in Him, if I must protect your rights because of my belief in Him, there's something stable about that. There's something that protects you. We don't make that case very well. But on the other hand, if religious freedom is what you think it is, and that is something cooked up by the state can take it away, which is what the ACLU is arguing it should be doing right now. Well, that might hurt me. You might like the policy outcome of that, but what if the other guys? I mean, what you're saying is whoever's in power is in charge of religious freedom. That's not what I believe. That's not what Catholics argue. Our voice should be heard on this. We should remind people that the Catholic demand for 2,000 years for liberty of the church created the whole idea of limited government. Jesus said, in effect, Caesar's got his powers, but he doesn't have any power over God. That's what Pope Gelasius said. That's what Catholics have been saying in different ways for 2 millennia. It limits the power of the state. And by the way, Catholic charities and Catholic soup kitchens and others limit the power of the state by doing things that the state would otherwise be doing. That's called civil society. We've been doing civil society since Jesus. We have contributed. All right. We have to remind ourselves that religious freedom, as I said before, is not unlimited if we're going to convince the Muslim world. We can't tell Muslims that religious freedom means the right of Osama bin Laden to do what he wants or Muslims to be violent. Religious freedom brings its own limits. This is a very important point to make. But here, and I'm truly going to end here fairly soon. We can't convince the Muslim world or anybody else of the value of religious freedom if we are prepared to give it a backseat to sexual liberation. I mean, it's an odd thing to bring up in the context of Muslim-majority countries. You want to see brutal treatment of homosexual persons? Go to almost any country in the Muslim world. I have had debates with my LGBT friends over this in which I say, you want us to do this in the Muslim-majority world? Give us religious freedom. Support religious freedom. There are Muslims who will make their own arguments, not in favor of gay marriage, but to say that their God is a merciful God, and that the brutalities practiced on people that are homosexual is not Islamic. They can't say that. Why? They don't have religious freedom. So you want to protect gays abroad, support this. All right. This brings us back to the question we began with. What's our responsibility as Catholics? Let me truly end. I know I've said that 5 times. But now I'm going to cite the Holy Father in the Bible, so it's a good sign. By citing one aspect of the Holy Father's signal theme, which is God's love and mercy for us, and our need to respond in love to Him. By making the church, I love this phrase, a field hospital in the world. A fallen world. My mind, as I thought about this, moves to that beautiful passage in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has the mind of man imagined what God has prepared for those who love Him. Pause on that last phrase. For those who love Him. What does it mean to love God in public in these trying times? High in the catalog of answers must be this. To love God, to be workers in His field hospital, is to live His truth in our own lives, first of all, and to advocate for those truths in public life. We must love our fellow citizens enough to tell them the truth about the beauty of sexuality in marriage, lifelong, faithful marriage. We must also never forget that our own heritage of religious freedom in this great nation has privileged us Catholics in a way that is surely part of God's mercy toward us and our church. In communicating these truths, of course, we must remind our fellow citizens that our religion is for everybody. Even those who are not Christians benefit from our devotion to them. I mentioned this a minute ago. But our Catholic charitable institutions, our homes for the aged, our soup kitchens, our hospitals, our schools, our relief agencies, immigration and naturalization services, the Little Sisters of the Poor. Thank you for being here, sisters. If I might say, your fight is so important to me personally and professionally. So if I might just say that. I don't want to embarrass you, but thank you. These women are icons of our church. They are the field hospital, and they don't just serve Catholics. They don't ask for religious affiliation. Why? Because they believe, like you and I believe, that God created each of us, and that Christ was incarnated, lived, suffered, died, and was resurrected. Not just for us, but for everyone. In his response to the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage, Cardinal Donald Wuerl emphasized that the Church will continue to welcome those with same-sex limitation or attractions. He noted correctly that if the Church banned sinners, it would be empty. It certainly wouldn't be a field hospital. But if the Cardinal also noted that the beautiful Catholic view on marriage and sexuality cannot and will not change. In his words, we must continue to love the sinner and hate the sin. I would simply add, and this is hard, but if we Catholics allow anyone to believe the Church will change its view of sexuality and of marriage as conjugal, permanent, and monogamous, that is, if we allow anyone to believe that we will abandon or that we are indifferent to the teachings of Jesus Christ, we are practicing a form of cruelty and deception that is the farthest thing from running a field hospital or dispensing mercy or loving our brothers and sisters. Recall what Jesus said in the parable of the sower, as recorded in Mark chapter 4. Remember this? The sower of the seed, the grain. Jesus has a big crowd, and he says, a man sows seeds of grain in 4 places, I'm paraphrasing. First, a path where the birds get it quickly. Second, shallow soil where it grows quickly but then withers. Among thorns, third path, which quickly choke the emerging grain. And then finally, in good soil, the forth good soil, where the grain grows and is fruitful. Now, when the crowd leaves after this teaching, the disciples take Jesus aside. And they say, Lord, what in the world are you talking about? I love the disciples when they do that. So he spells it out for them. Remember this?
Yeah, here.
He spells it out for them. He tells them exactly what he meant. He said, the seed is the Word. It's me. It's Jesus. My teachings. When the first example, it's Satan who gobbles up the seeds. In the second, the shallow soil represents those who hear the word, says Jesus, and receive it with joy. But when persecution arises on account of the word, they head for the tall grass. Jesus didn't say that, but you get the point. That's what he meant. In the third example, the thorns represent those who hear the word, but in Jesus' words, they delight in riches and the desire for other things, and that chokes the word. These people too head for the tall grass. Let's take hope and courage from Jesus' final example. The good soil that is fruitful. This is the field hospital. When we contemplate how we are to love the Lord, let's exercise that religious freedom which is given by Him and cannot be taken away by any court. Let's share His truths with our fellow citizens, winsomely, with love and charity and courage. And let's stay out of the tall grass, which is a very crowded area already. If we do act with courage and love, we can fulfill our responsibility to our fellow citizens, our country, and we can hope to the millions of Christians who are suffering terribly because they too love the Lord. Thank you.